All right, welcome back for another installment of the Wide Ride Podcast. Manny Navarro here, Miami Hurricanes beat writer for The Athletic. Tuesday, February 7th, around 2 p.m. Eastern Time. And we've got a special guest on, a man who we had on the show last year, right when Mario Cristobal was first hired, who knows the University of Miami as well as anyone. That would be The Athletic's Bruce Feldman, my colleague. Bruce, obviously a busy time for Mario Cristobal, just a year in to his job, having to replace his two coordinators. We'll get to the hires and kind of what we're hearing on those fronts and the latest news involving Lance Guidry. But I wanted to first just get your impression of what did you think of Mario's first season and the fact that literally we're here in the middle of having to replace two coordinators just after 1 year.
So on one hand, the recruiting part seems to be going well, right? So I think the offensive line has been a significant upgrade in what it sounds like talent-wise, what they're going to have. Certainly with a couple of 5 stars coming in, you have a big guard transfer coming in from Alabama, a really highly regarded center coming in from UCF. I think those are key pieces. The part where on the field was, I mean, there's no sugarcoating. It was dreadful. Whether it was a Middle Tennessee game, they got shelled on defense. The offense was a mess. I went down there and I said, we were out at one of the practices together. I think it was their first padded practice in August. And it was the first time I'd been down there in a while. I was like, wow, they are really limited skill talent wise. The receiving core, and I think Restrepo was there, but he's their most reliable guy, and then he got hurt. But they were really mediocre even with him, right? And the running back room was shaky, and then they had a bunch of injuries. O-line hasn't been good at Miami for a long time, so you looked at that and go, man, they're gonna struggle, right? I thought they did a better job of taking transfers on defense than they did on offense, and it was worse than I thought. I think it was worse than everybody thought it was going to be. So here we are, the recruiting piece, which it's Mario. I expected it to be really, really strong. And I think for that part, it's been good. Now we got to see what they're going to do post spring in that portal window, especially with skill guys.
Yeah.
I mean, you're counting to some degree on 2 freshman running backs coming in to make a splash because it's not strong there right now. Receiving, it's just not good. And it seems like they need to add still some pieces on the D line. So I think at least now Lance Guidry's here, what they're going to be on defense to a large degree. We can get into some of the staff moves that we think that may happen subsequent on that side of the ball. But offensively, Mario's still working through who he's going to hire. So now you not only have a new OC, you have the quarterback coach is gone, the receivers coach who was the OC is gone, and that's where they need a lot of help. And so everything I've heard from there, and you and I have obviously talked a lot offline, it's rocky right now inside that building. The one thing, and I don't want to answer too many questions, like at once, but like everything I've heard is, there's a lot of dead weight on the staff right now. Mario has to sort through, and that's from people there. And I'm interested to see how it goes going forward.
Yeah, I mean, I got the same impression, talking to a few people inside the building here just in the last couple of weeks of, like you said, dead weight or guys that just didn't live up to the expectations maybe that Mario had for them when he brought them in. And I know he takes a long time. He vets guys. This is sort of a long process. Everybody sort of makes their commentary. What takes so long with Mario? But I think personally, I feel like being on the West Coast, being sort of removed from Miami for a while. Let's not forget. I mean, he was at Alabama before that, and he was only briefly here with I think Al Golden for like a month before he left for Alabama. He hadn't been around the program, hadn't really seen what had happened, and I think he kind of stepped in and was surprised by some of the holes that they had talent wise, and sort of just had a rough first year. I think, like you said, he's done a phenomenal job recruiting. I think they're going to continue to add guys through the transfer portal. I know they are. They're looking for 2 elite outside wide receivers that they're hoping as we know now, guys can always be encouraged to enter the transfer portal, right? And I think defensive tackle still a position they'll address. I think safety, but from a roster perspective, I think at their best, and I've had this conversation with a few people, I think they're an 8-win team next year. And probably not more than that, just because they don't have the kind of depth that you need at certain positions. You have a lot of young guys, and as you mentioned, playmakers. You need them to win games. So a lot of hurdles for them. I think an 8-win season will be good. I think that'll be sort of seen as a victory, at least for recruits. I think that'll help them with a lot of the 2024 kids that they're after, especially here locally. They've got some elite 5-star receivers. There's always elite receivers here in South Florida that you can try and go out and get. But I think they've got to show them that they can score points and not be dreadful as they were under Josh Gaddis. So all important moves, which is really what affects, I think, this OC hire, right? He's got to find a guy who relates better, I think, to some of the players maybe than Josh Gaddis did. I think at times, my impression from what I heard was, it was a little too explosive. He was a little too honest and hurt some feelings of guys, I think, both on the staff and players in the room. And when that happens, you can tune people out. So I think we'll talk about Guidry in a moment, but let's start with offense because that's really where I think the biggest hurdles are for Mario. What are you sort of hearing? I mean, there's been names reported. Doug Nussmeier, obviously formerly of the Cowboys, who coached with Mario at Alabama. I think he's a legit guy in this. Jason Candle, you and I reported his name last year in a story we did as a guy who could potentially be somebody Mario really wants here. And there's some other names, but I guess what's your impression of that? Let's start with offensive coordinator.
Yeah, this is more the wild card piece of it. Look, I think what was challenging was Gaddis turned out to be a bad fit there. Like he and you'd hear things. The offense coordinator was coming in here, but you don't get to pick your O-line guy. You don't get to pick basically anybody, right? And so everything I had heard was that he and Frank Ponce, the quarterback coach, did not mesh at all. It was rough, as we talked about some of the issues of what are you going to walk into now if you're the offensive coordinator. Stu Mandel and I on our Audible episode last week talked some about this, where in terms of, as you said, Manny, Mario's process of hiring is beyond meticulous. And I think it is challenging for a lot of guys who are in that process, who are part of it. And I think, I think he will land on some good guys, but I think ultimately it's like, how do they fit, right? Because from everything I've heard, there's a bunch of guys who are there now who really don't fit with what Mario expects, whether that's what he expects work ethic wise, recruiting wise, a variety of things. There are some mismatched parts right there. And I think, and you and I've talked about this some offline, is I think in terms of what he's expecting, are you going to, so in some ways, the Oregon guys, they can understand what Mario was looking for, but they may not fit in Miami, right? I mean, there's just a lot of stuff going on that, they may not fit of what he's looking for in Miami. They may not fit culturally around there as much. I just think that some guys have big names, but they may not be doing the work that you'd expect them or they need them to do right now. And so I would not be surprised to see more staff shakeup. But in terms of the offensive side of the ball, short of, I think he leans on Alex Mirabal. I know those guys have had some hard conversations, but that's the one certainty of the guy I would expect to be back. I don't know how much flexibility a new offensive coordinator is going to have. Will that guy now be the guy who runs the quarterback room? That's usually how it works. It wasn't going to be that way with Josh Gaddis. And I think that will be interesting. Doug Nussmeier's been a really good quarterbacks guy throughout his career, obviously played it at a high level in the NFL. And he's been through this Saban world, and he and Mario know each other in terms of if Nussmeier wants to come back to the college game. I think he was with the Cowboys for 5 or 6 years. We'll see what, he has had some opportunities, or at least is in the mix for some NFL coordinator jobs as well. You mentioned Jason Candle. From what I had heard, there was it maybe looked like it was trending that way late last week. And then I don't know if things have cooled from, his side or either side. I'm not sure, if that's going to happen at this point. There's some other names of some, well-regarded group of five coordinators that I know who I think Mario is looking at and considering. Again, it comes back to fit. I think it comes back to what Mario expects from them and also how those guys might fit in running the offense at Miami. I mean, there's a little bit of a jigsaw puzzle piece to this. And I'm curious to see, if Doug Nussmeier ends up being the guy, I think that's a really solid hire for an offense that had a lot of dysfunction last year. I think what could be key for Miami is, do you have somebody who expects what the head coach is looking for and also can really run the show? Because right now, I feel like that was absent last year. And I don't think that was, as much Josh Gaddis. I think it was everything around him. It was like a lot of dysfunction there. And going forward, again, if it's Doug Nussmeier, I think that would be a solid hire just because he would bring stability and he knows what he's doing. Um, I know that's probably not a splashy hire for a lot of, there could be group of five guys who probably statistically put up bigger numbers at recent history. When Doug Nussmeier was at Alabama, I think you were running Nick Saban's offense. And at the time, Nick Saban wanted a certain thing. And he was like, he knew he was going to win with defense. I think things evolved under Saban over time there, but it wasn't that way 10 years ago. So I know this, Nussmeier is really good with quarterbacks. I mean, you've seen his track record with it. I think that's solid. Again, I don't know if he wants to come back to college football, but we'll see where Mario lands with this.
Yeah, it's an interesting, like you said, it's the wild card because I think a lot of eggs were put into the candle basket, and that's who he probably really wanted, and for whatever reason, it just hasn't happened yet, and so he might have to pivot elsewhere, and so there, like you said, there's other names, there's other guys that he likes, and Mario has a long list. We know that he has a list of guys that he likes, and when he went through this process last year with Gaddis, I mean, Gaddis really wasn't his first choice either. I mean, this was sort of hey, you approach guys, you see if the fit is right, and then they have questions too. So it's not always just a perfect marriage.
Yeah, Manny, and I don't even know, like I've known Mario for 25 years. I don't know who I would categorize as who his first choice was,
Hmm.
because there are times, and this is the part of the process where go back to his Oregon OC hire where he landed with Joe Moorhead. From people who were involved in that process, there were people who thought Joe Moorhead did not, and I like Joe Moorhead a lot, and he did a good job there, but he was not the one who kind of blew everybody away in the interview process. A
Right.
lot of people there expected Jed Fish to have gotten that job, and Mario ultimately ended up with Joe Moorhead, who was probably a more, um, was probably a more attractive name in terms of buzz because of what he had done at Penn State. Um, and it worked out well. Now, look, Fish has turned out to seems to be doing a really good job as a head coach at Arizona, turning that place around. But there were other guys that I know he was interested in. And as it related to last year, like there were guys I knew Mario was interested in, and I think they thought he was interested. And then there was like, wait, am I in this? I haven't heard anything in 2 weeks. And you end up, what happens is, Kendall Briles' name surfaces, and then all of a
Right.
sudden it gets leveraged into a bigger job. Was Mario really, is that the guy he really wanted to hire there?
Hmm.
I have my doubts on that. I mean, there's other guys that but it's like, oh, so and so was offered. Well, they were talked to seriously, but I think that's the part with his process where eventually these names get out because it plays out for a long time, and what, his agent has conversations with people and vets people, but ultimately does Mario look at that and go, okay, I'm going to look at their film. I'm going to see how I feel like they fit, and it doesn't always work. It obviously didn't work last year. There were some other hires he had that didn't work out. Now look, when he was at FIU, he made a lot of really good hires of people nobody knew of at the time, and then ended up
Hmm.
going on to bigger things. So I'm curious to see what the next move is. I know we'll get to this in a minute, but like I do think in terms of the guy he hired to run the defense, I actually think this is going to be an upgrade from what they just had with Kevin Steele. Because if you look at what on field, Lance Guidry did a fantastic job at Marshall. I know from talking to Charles Huff, the head coach there, how good he was and what people think of him as a coach, so Mario got the Saban blessing on Kevin Steele, and he pivoted and got him. I think you can ask your listeners how well people thought it was. They had more talent on that side of the ball, and there was a lot of 40-point games, and there was the Middle Tennessee game. I mean,
Yeah, it
I
was a
don't.
disaster at
Yeah, I
times.
mean,
Yeah.
so I think Lance Guidry, to me, will be a better defensive coordinator for Miami than Kevin Steele was.
Yeah. We can get into Guidry right now if you want. Look, Steele going to Alabama, I think raised some eyebrows, right, from Alabama fans. I don't know if they necessarily thought of him as a first choice, but he was very experienced. And my impression was, for what he did at Miami in the one season, I did see areas where they improved. I thought, you look at the safety position, Cam Kitchens was an All-American. He took a step forward. I thought they improved at linebacker. They got some better play out of guys who've been pretty porous under Manny Diaz. I mean, Corey Flagg actually, I think his PFF grade increased pretty tremendously. It was actually respectable compared to what it was the season before. So there were some improvements made on defense, but like you said, too many games where they were giving up over 40 points, too many explosive plays. And I
I
think,
mean, they went from, if you look at just like the stat I would probably use as much as anything is yards per play in the
right,
ACC, they went from 6th to 13th. Now, that's
right,
not all his fault, but like I feel like on that side of the ball, they actually tried to upgrade talent a lot more than they did on offense. Again, I'm not saying this was all his fault,
right.
but I'd be shocked if they were as bad on defense this year, as mediocre as they were in year one for Mario.
Yeah, I mean, I look again. I'm not saying it were great. I just said there were small little areas where I saw some improvement from individuals, guys that I thought took the next step. Now, with Guidry, they may be ready to play much better, right? I think first of all, what the success he had at Marshall was pretty astonishing. I didn't realize. I didn't watch a lot of Marshall football. I know they beat Notre Dame earlier in the year. I watched a little bit of their bowl game victory. But really, I didn't study Marshall, and I'm sitting there looking at all these stats, as preparing the story, and I'm like, wow, they're top 10 in this, they're top 10 in that.
They're number
Uh,
one, yeah, they're number one in third down. They're number
yeah,
three in yards per play. He did a really, really good job. Now, the kind of elephant in the room is, and Lance Guidry has some personal baggage from a long time ago, and I
mhm,
think that probably prevented some other schools previously from looking at him.
right,
But I think that was like a dozen years ago,
hmm,
some of those issues, and so I think in terms of people are like, well, why was he at Marshall? And I think that was part of it. Now, look, Tulane just hired him,
right,
which is obviously, in a lot of ways, I feel like Tulane, not to compare Tulane and Miami, but as a private school with a strong academic reputation, they ended up hiring him. Um, I think that Mario Cristobal has always liked him, and has always been thought very highly of him. I knew Ed Ogeron really thought very highly of Guidry too. They both are Louisiana guys with Louisiana roots. This is a guy who a lot of coaches think is a really good football coach.
yeah, and I would say this, Mario, from what Max Olson, our colleague at the Athletic, was telling me a little while ago. Apparently, Mario tried to hire him when he was at FIU, and I guess you had heard the same thing, right? It was right before
Yeah.
Mario got fired. I think when Guidry was at Western Kentucky. So obviously there's a tie there. Mario's always had his eye on him. Looking at his defense, and again, I didn't watch a ton, but what would you say are some of the trademarks maybe that you know of? I know they put up good numbers, but is it a traditional 4-3? Is it a mix of things? What do you know
It's
about
it's
Guidry?
it's a really good mix of things, and I feel like they do a very good job of keeping quarterbacks kind of off balance, right?
Mhm.
And if you look at kind of what they've done now, first of all, I think what's been always really good is you see an aggressive, and you're going to want to hear the, those buzzwords. I mean, no
Mhm.
defensive coordinator wants to be known as like a read and react guy, but I just feel like his guys are able to play fast. I think he's a really good teacher of what they're doing. Look, it sounds like from everything I heard, Kevin Steele was a good teacher of what they were doing. I just think that in terms of, it's how do you get it done? I know Mario did not want a 3-3-5 stack. Like Tony Gibson's a really good defense coordinator in the ACC. I think there's certain things Mario was looking for in terms of, and maybe things he was less comfortable with. But with this guy, I feel like you are going to get a lot of the elements that Miami fans always want to see in a defense. And, I think it's just going to come at people maybe in a little bit of a different form.
Mhm. Well, I mean, look, if he can get them to be a top 10 scoring defense, in a year or two, I think Mario will feel pretty good about where the program is, considering how Manny Diaz had them back in 2017, right, when they were one of the best in the country and winning 10 games, forcing all kinds of turnovers. Guidry's defense did force a ton of turnovers last year. I think they were fifth in the country. So if he can get
I think it's
Miami to,
confusing. I think it's confused. Like Manny's very aggressive,
Mhm.
still is at Penn State. I think it's what you see, it's confusing quarterbacks. And I think
Mhm.
they're really good. They were really hard to throw the football against.
Mhm.
Um, and he's a back end guy. And I think that'll fit well. I mean, Kevin Steele was too, but I think this guy is just got a really good feel for giving quarterbacks a hard time to get comfortable.
Yeah. And look, at this point, I mean, there's nowhere to go but up after what we saw last season. Um, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the situation in general at Miami, the fact that they're spending a lot of money. I just got off the phone with somebody a little while ago who said that I think they've got 2 years left on the contract for Gaddis. I think he was making close to 1.5 million. The old school Miami, they wouldn't spend money like this back in the day, but they are, and they're helping Mario through the process early on. I, I think they're for real. I think this is going to continue. They're going to support Mario for as long as they can financially. But are you a believer that Mario has all 10 years to get this right?
I think he has I think 10 years is a long, long time
Hmm.
for anything in college football. So I wouldn't look at it through that prism. I think he has enough I'm looking at a pencil. I think he has a full eraser on top of it. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
Um, I don't think they want to hit the reset button 2 years from now again, right? I think I would expect, and this is something you and I have talked a little bit about. Look, does Jason Taylor end up on the field as a defensive line coach? What do they do with Big Joe, who came with him from Oregon? He's getting paid a lot of money too, and I think
Hmm.
he has a 3-year deal. I think there's some other position coaches who are very well compensated,
Yeah.
who I wouldn't be surprised if they would like to see move on. Um, because of their contract situation. I'm not sure they will. So now what do you do with them? This gets into the dead weight thing a little bit.
Right.
It's not to say everybody off the field is dead weight either. I just think there's definitely some challenges he's going to have to navigate. I think this was a big piece of getting Lance Guidry hired. It's going to be a critical piece of what happens with the OC. It's not just to say that it's just a coordinator's thing.
Right.
I wouldn't, you and I, again, this is another thing we've talked about a lot, is like, how are they as recruiters? Like Guidry, according to Huff, is a really, really good recruiter and really good evaluator. Ultimately, though, Mario is the best recruiter he's going to have. And I think so much of it is going to be, what is the product on the field start to look like? It's going to be hard to get receivers to transfer to Miami if the offense is sputtering and there isn't an identity to it, right? I mean, a lot of people have been really critical of Manny Diaz's regime. They were, as you said a couple of minutes ago, they were really good on defense under him. And when Mark Rick was there, they really struggled on offense. Rhett Lashley gave them some form of an identity. Now it was something that was a little different, but they moved the football, and then a bunch of these kids who I think could have helped them. Now they're going to Dallas and they're going to play at SMU. And I'm sure they'll have more success probably in the AAC than they were in the ACC. But I think it's going to be so important to find out what is this identity going to be,
Right.
and I don't know the answer to that. And I think until they get that sorted out and established, I think it's, kind of nobody at Miami wants to hear it was a year zero kind of thing, because it wasn't,
Right.
but I I don't know how long the leash is going to be or whatever you want to say. I mean, if you there's I would not expect to have 10 years of, like, all right, we're
7-6
close.
football, right? Or 8 and
Yeah.
4. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, they're not paying for that or whatever. And I don't think that's Mario's expectations. I know it's not. It's just a matter of like, when the first year that they had at Oregon, when he was on Willie Taggart's staff, they had some talent and pieces, but not a lot, and they sputtered. And then they got the thing going pretty fast. Now they didn't, they won Pac-12 titles, but they didn't. There was still a lot of 3 steps forward, 1 step back. I felt like this year was a lot of 1 step forward, 2 steps back on the field. And the question is now, do they flip that? Because, who knows what they're going to be able to land, come spring. I think it's a harder sell now to land like the equivalent of a Jordan Addison, or like that kind of difference maker skill guy coming off of last year than it was when people were talking about Tyler Van Dyke as a first round pick. I don't know
Absolutely.
who's talking about him as such now. And how many big time receivers did Miami take a flail at last year? Tank Dell. There's like 3 or 4 other guys who ended
Zay
up not.
Zay Zay Flowers was another one.
Zay Flowers from BC, like I said, Tank Dell from Houston. Those guys would have been by far the best receivers Miami had last year. Didn't come. And so there's going to be talent that is going to be looking to be on the move. It doesn't take, you don't need 5 of them, but you need somebody that scares defenses.
Yeah.
And to me, that's as important as anything, because then, like, I don't know. Like, I just know from talking to guys on that staff last year, when they saw what they saw in the spring, it was like, wow, this should never be this bad.
Yeah. I agree. I mean, they didn't think they were going to be great, but I also don't think they were going to be 5-7. Like nobody in there was like, well, we're not even going to make a bowl game. I think
Well,
that
I
was
think that's like the skill talent was underwhelming. I think then all of a sudden it was like it was kind of gutted by some injuries on top of
yeah,
that.
right.
So
Yeah. All right. I got some mailbag questions. I know you've been very gracious with your time, but if I could ask you a couple, you
yeah,
let me know when you got to bounce. All right. This is from David Hernandez. These are my Twitter followers here. What does this say if the DC was hired before the OC? What possible dark horse OC candidate could you see Mario hiring? I don't know that timing matters. It's just kind of right.
yeah. I think it's get this one done, get done when you can. I mean, Mario's, when I've talked to him, was like, hey, we're just trying to find the most qualified candidate for the offensive coordinator job now. And I think what's a little different is usually when you hire a defensive coordinator, it's one thing to be able to bring guys. I feel like with an offensive coordinator, a lot of times it's like, okay, does he fit with the O-line coach or whatever? And this was such a weird dynamic because it wasn't like different offensive line coach, but also this was a guy who's not working with quarterbacks,
Right.
right? So I think, one of the names that came up last year for the quarterback's job, and ultimately he went with the more senior guy with Ponce, who he had who had worked with before. I mean, was Alex Mortensen, who was really well regarded on the Alabama staff. And had been an OC briefly at like New Mexico Highlands, a much smaller school, but had basically been the behind the scenes guy at Alabama. Now he's the OC at UAB. In terms of, I think Mortensen, because he and Gaddis worked together at Alabama, at least there was a little more familiarity than, you had the combination with Ponce. I don't know what the combination is going to look like. I mean, you can take a look at guys, who've had a lot of success and put up big numbers. Like, I did not think some of the guys who put up some of the biggest stats in the country can be air raid guys. that does not seem like what I think Mario would ultimately
No.
hire. Now, what he defines as an air raid guy, that could be a moving target a little bit, but I definitely think you look at some of these offenses that are really prolific, they're just stuff I don't necessarily think you would see at per se. But we'll see what he ends up doing here.
This question is from Mark Huston on Twitter. You kind of touched on this earlier. He asked if Guidry's a relentless recruiter, and how will high level recruits that Mario and Miami go after view a guy who hasn't really coached at the Power Five level yet? Do you think that really matters with recruits?
I honestly don't. Especially with defensive guys. I mean, it's funny just to show the sausage being made. We were on Slack and you asked me that, and I went to Huff and I said him who was his former boss, and Huff is one of the better recruiters in the country at one time. Was thought as the best recruiter, and he was like he's an ace. He said he got 2 studs for them from McNeese State, and he said 3 or 4 guys from high school are really good players. He expects them to start for Marshall this year. He goes, he's a really, really good evaluator. So I would, when you first asked me that, I was thinking, you know what, they need to get good coordinators. And if they're not good recruiters or not, that's not their forte, so be it. But it turns out, sounds like this guy is. Again, I think we sometimes get too caught up in who's a good recruiter and who's not. The truth is, if you have a good product, and look, we know Miami's very active on the NIL front. It can be an attractive place, but it also, until people have a track record on offense, I think that's the part. Like people want to go play for Lincoln Riley because they know he's had a high level of success as an offensive coach. That's why Jordan Addison's going. That's why Caleb followed him. That's why Travis Dye went there, so, and that's why they're going to continue to get guys. And I think that stuff didn't happen overnight.
This one's interesting. Rusty Sidaris, you obviously speak to a lot of coaches. He says, would love to know how Mario is viewed in coaching circles as far as whether he's someone talented people want to work for or not.
He's really demanding. I think this is a good question. Not to say the other ones aren't, but it's a little complicated.
Right.
He's really demanding. Nick Saban is incredibly demanding too. Here's the thing. I work with Urban Meyer now. Urban Meyer was not an easy guy for people to work with, right? So for all the coaches who's like, oh yeah, this guy's a player's coach or whatever, some of the best regarded coaches are not easy to work for, right? Nick Saban, definitely, from everything I've heard, not easy to work for. Jim Harbaugh, not easy to work for. Urban Meyer was not easy to work for. And so it's not.
He's not alone. He's not alone in this.
He's not alone. Thank you. But
Yeah.
I think the part that, towards his question that I think is worth mentioning is Mario's process is kind of notorious in the business of the hiring process. It is arduous. There's a lot of names involved. There's a lot, it's a little different than that. Does that scare guys off? I mean, it got him, I think Lance Guidry is a really good DC. There was probably 5 names I think you and I had thrown around 2 days ago. And if you said to me who probably on paper might be the best of those defensive coordinators, I think it's the guy I ended up hiring. Now, there's one of those names I can think of was probably a more flashy recruiter and probably, has a good track record as a defense coordinator. But I think knowing what Mario thinks of Guidry, I was like, this is a big hire for him. To me, it's a lot more impressive hire than pulling Kevin Steele out of the Maryland football office last, whatever it was, January. But I think the demanding part, he's going to grind recruiting. I mean, that is not easy, right? I mean, especially if you're talking to guys who are talking to NFL places, because whenever I go to the combine, I reconnect with old college coaches who are up there who, a lot of them never want to come back to college because the recruiting piece Never mind Mario. The recruiting piece in general is such a pain in the ass for them.
especially with
You know,
NIL nowadays and everything else
well,
that's
then
going
you
on.
put that on top of it. But it's
Yeah,
like the part that I had always heard was twofold. Was one, it's summer and you're off for a couple of weeks, and then all of a sudden now I got to go back to the facility because some recruit is in town for a baseball tournament and he's taking an unofficial on the campus. Now I got to go there.
right.
Or the other thing is like you don't have to worry about somebody like if your three technique gets into a bar fight in the NFL, it's like he's going to call his agent. If it happens in college, it's all hands on deck of how do we handle this or whatever.
Right.
Um, so I think there's just a lot of stuff that goes into it that's not unique to Mario, but the things that are unique are the hiring process itself, and then also what is the staff chemistry like that you're walking into.
Yeah.
Like that, I think, because of staff chemistry needs a lot of work right now after a rocky first year. I think that's the thing that like people are going to have to assess on this job,
Yeah.
and only look, whoever jumps into it, I don't know this for a fact, but I think they're going to know what they're jumping into to some degree.
I'll let you go on this one. This is from Joe U. Kane. Do you think Charlie Strong stays on board?
I don't know what Charlie Strong's other options are going to be.
I would.
If it's
I was going to say maybe he goes back to Alabama with Steele. I mean, he was there in 2020. I don't know if.
he was, I just don't know if you're him, do you want to go back and be an analyst there?
Hmm.
Like just to show a couple more cards here, there's a lot of people who think, myself included, that Jeremy Pruitt's going to end up back on that staff in some capacity. Saban really respects him. Now he's
Yeah.
got some NCAA baggage that they have to sort out, probably with the SEC on that. But I think that's another guy who'll go back there. I don't know, what is Charlie's other options going to be. I know he likes Florida. I mean, I know he likes the state of Florida.
Right.
Um,
Yeah, he likes living in South Florida.
Yeah.
He's enjoying it.
So I don't know, you know.
I would tend to think there's going to be some guys that he's going to be able to bring with him, right? I mean, Guidry, he's got to be able to probably replace a couple guys on the staff.
Yeah, I mean, look, we think Jason Taylor, at least I do, is going to probably get bumped up.
I heard the same thing a
Um,
little while ago, by the way. So
yeah,
yeah,
and
so we're hearing.
so
Mhm.
we'll see what happens with. There's guys, like we both know DVD. He's pretty well thought of, and there's some guys who've looked at him. I don't know where he fits into the picture on this. Miami has a few guys in its bullpen who I would say don't fit in necessarily the category of dead weight. Like there's another guy on the offensive side of the ball that I wouldn't be surprised if he ended up,
Woody
you know,
all.
but yeah,
Hmm. Right.
yeah. And I know Mario likes him and really thinks highly of him.
Hmm.
And he knows what Mario wants, and he's going to work the way Mario wants him to work or expects guys to work. And I think that was missing a lot. You can say what you want about the talent deficiencies in certain places, and you and I have talked a lot about it. But then there's the other parts of it which get into the culture of what you're trying to build, not just what you have, but what you're trying to build. And I think those are things that I'm interested to see how it goes because, I think it was obviously bad on the field. It's like I think he knows he has a lot of work to do off the field, not necessarily recruiting related, but just like, how do I get this thing to
Right.
go the way I want it to go? I would like, because, hot seat talk or anything like that. You said 10 years, you put me on the other extreme.
Right.
I don't think there's anybody in panic mode,
Right.
who is connected to Mario, like in terms of leadership wise. Then there might be people who are in the building on staff who are like, yeah, this is not going to work or whatever. But those are people, my guess is, who Mario is probably going to need to shove out the door or hope that they leave. So it's a weird mix. And I think, because Miami fans live it and it's very public, I think you're seeing some of the warts where a lot of times at other places, you probably don't see them or there's just not the same spotlight on it.
Yeah. Bruce, thanks for coming on and doing this with me. I got to get you on more frequently, and I know Miami fans love to hear your voice, love to hear your takes. Make sure you listen to Bruce and Stu on the Audible. It's one of the best podcasts out there. I enjoy it. Listen to it every week when I do my walks in the afternoon. So thanks for coming on.
Always a pleasure, Manny. Talk to you soon.
All right.